I'd like to welcome you all to the Langley Adams Library. Thank you for coming here on such a gorgeous day. And tonight we have Kevin Gardner, who's written The Granite Kiss. And he is an author and tradesman and actor and teacher, and has won the Golden Mike Award. Did New Hampshire Public Radio, the syndicated show Storylines New England, and probably the other awards too that I can't think of at this moment.
I can't either.
Okay, good.
I don't think there are.
All right. And I also wanted to mention a couple other programs. In a couple weeks, on Monday, August 26th, we will be having Ann Barrett coming, and she'll be doing Short Skirts, Oh My, the Evolution of the Women's Movement, and that will be at 6:30. And we'll also have a book group at River Pines, and they are reading The Finest Hours, and that's at 2 o'clock on the 27th. And I will let Kevin Gardner.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. Well, good evening. Good to see you. Great to be in Groveland, a town I'm going to admit I have never even heard of. Now I'll never be able to say that again. But I'm delighted you were willing to give up a perfectly good evening to listen to a total stranger talk about rocks, and in honor of that willingness of yours, I brought my very best linen from what I'm going to do to it. I'm going to talk a little bit about give you an overview of the history of our New England stone walls. I'm going to talk about how their styles changed over time. I'm going to talk a little bit about how they are made and what holds them together. And I'm going to speak very briefly about some of these other books that I have brought before I go to the part of the program that's probably the most fun for me, and that's answering any questions that you have. So as I compress all this information and I try to get through it as efficiently as possible, I want you to remember things that I'm perhaps not giving you enough information about, or things that you'd like more elaboration on, and take me back to those things when I get to the end of my little spiel here. But I want to begin with a bit of a disclaimer. And that is, I don't think most of you will have too much trouble with this, but if you can't see what I'm doing on this tabletop while I'm going on, please don't worry about it. It has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. Just trying to keep my hands busy. But I want to start by talking about a particular year in the history of the New England stone walls. Turns out to be a very important year, in retrospect anyway, and that year was 1871. In 1871, our dedicated federal government, which then as now likes to keep itself busy, decided that it would be a good idea to measure all the fencing in the United States. Not bad. They delegated this critically important job to the Department of Agriculture, which took a year to do it, and then released an enormous report that was full of many facts. One of them was this: that in the 6 New England states and the state of New York combined, in other words, the northeast corner of the country, there were over 250,000 miles of stone walls. 250,000 miles. That is more stone wall than there is railroad track in this country at the present time. It is more stone wall by quite a lot than the entire length of the U.S. coastline. It is enough stone wall to go around the world 10 times. It is enough stone wall to stretch from the parking lot of this library in a straight line to the surface of the moon. This was in 1871. What is truly amazing about that number is that there is no question that it is low. It's not accurate on the low side. And this is so for two reasons. For one thing, the report only talks about walls. It only concerns itself with what was built to be used as fencing. Whereas in New England, as I'm sure most of you know, enormous numbers of different kinds of structures were built out of what we call dry stone. And if you do not know that term, let me explain it. A dry stone structure, as opposed to one that is wet or mortared, is a structure made out of native stone that is not held together by any kind of adhesive. In other words, there's nothing between the stones to hold them in place except for their own weight and bulk and the skill of the builder who put them there. That is what dry stonework consists of. This report, which focused itself on walls, did not mention many, many other things that are made of dry stone. And by that I mean stone-lined wells, bridges, causeways, ramps, all kinds of passageways, and especially, of course, cellar holes and the foundations of buildings. None of that was included in this report. And that, of course, is extremely extensive in terms of dry stone work throughout New England, those kinds of structures, in addition to the thousands and thousands of miles of walls. So that's the first reason why this report was certainly low in terms of its number. The second reason has to do with the progress, the historical progress, or lack of same, in New England agriculture during the course of the 19th century. And here's where history really has something to do with the story of New England's stone walls. Because the technology of agriculture changed so profoundly during the course of the 19th century that it essentially left stone walls behind. And this is where the timing of the Department of Agriculture's report was so critically significant. Because 1871 is about as close as you're going to get in terms of a specific year to the moment when we began to lose more stone walls than we were gaining. By 1871, the process of losing New England's stone walls was already well underway. And this was happening because, again, of the profound changes in the technology of farming that occurred during the 19th century. I just want to give you one example of how this worked. When European settlers first began to create farms here in New England, they were following a model of the disposition of land that was essentially medieval in nature. And that was because in the early part of the 17th century, when white settlers first began to show up here and make farms, all work done on any farm was done completely by hand, of course, with hand tools. They had animal power in the form of oxen and then later horses. But most of the work that was done in terms of sowing or mowing was done essentially by a person with a hand tool. This meant that their prevailing philosophy about how to break up land into parcels held that small fields produced best. And so the model that was brought to New England by the British and other nationalities who began to make farms here was a model that broke the land up into small parcels of 1 to 3 to 5 acres. These are the size of the parcels which began to be bounded off by stone walls as time went on. And so the entire farming land of New England was broken up into these very small parcels. However, in the middle of the 19th century, the old medieval model of handwork began to disappear, began to be replaced by machinery. And so I want you to imagine that you are cutting the hay in a nice little 3-acre field that's bound off by neatly built stone walls in a kind of rectangle or square. If you're cutting the hay with a scythe, that's had been done for thousands of years before, you can literally walk right up into the corners and cut every blade of grass right to the wall that exists. But if you're suddenly pulling a 10-foot cutter bar behind a team of horses and you come to that corner, you have to start turning about 20 feet before the corner. And that means that in every single field you have, there are now 4 useless triangles of empty land that cannot be used. This was the process that caused many New England farmers, especially by the latter part of the 19th century, when this report was prepared, to begin to knock down their walls, dig big trenches beside them, topple the walls into the trenches and bury them far enough down below the surface of the ground so they wouldn't be disturbed by plows or anything else that disturbed the surface as it came along. And so that process was well underway by the time the Department of Agriculture did its report on stone walls, and therefore is the second reason why their number of 250,000 miles, impressive as it is almost certainly not accurate in terms of the total amount of stone wall that we once had. Well, how did we get all these stone walls in the first place? They began to be built, of course, not right away when settlers first appeared in the area, because their first choice of fencing was inevitably organics. It was brush and it was stumps. It was things that they pulled from the surface of the ground as they began to clear the forest away to make their fields and their pastures. However, nobody in a New England audience needs to be reminded that we live in a remarkably stony part of the country. And so part of this process, of course, was involving the clearing away of enormous amounts of surface stone, which instead of turning into walls, at least in the early days, they tended to simply take to the edges of the fields and throw it up against their organic fencing, their stumps and their brush and their split rails, so that it was at least out of the way of the work they had to do. Then they began to discover, after a generation or two in any given area, that they were, believe it or not, running out of wood. Our forebears here on this land, who were farmers, believed when they first arrived that the forest was essentially an unlimited resource, but they quickly found out that that was not so. After a generation or two with the land clear, and I'm sure most of you know that the proportion of cleared to forested land in New England is almost exactly the reverse right now of what it once was, say 150 or 175 years or so ago. In my own state of New Hampshire, for instance, that proportion is something like 85 to 15%. By that I mean that 82 to 85% of the New Hampshire landscape is currently covered in forest. However, 175 years ago, that proportion was exactly reversed. Most of the land south of the White Mountains was wide open and turned into fields of one kind or another. This deforestation that went along with the agriculture of the region is a major reason for New England being as stony as it is, by the way. Settlers and their activities were at least partially responsible for turning New England to a much stonier place than it had been when they arrived. Mostly because they tended to cut all the trees off hilly areas, and it precipitated an intense process of erosion that continued and does continue to this day in many places. And so the stoniness of New England that forced them to clear so much stone off their acreage was at least in part induced by their own activities. But that's another part of the story. The settlers who found that they were no longer able to build their fencing out of organic material looked around and began to think of ways that they could continue, of course, because farms have to have fences for all kinds of reasons. And then they realized that the answer was sitting right there beside their old organic fences. And so the story of how we began to acquire stone walls here is a story of something that happened as a result of necessity. And as they became a little bit more creative about what they were taking off their land, and began to simply reorganize those long rubble piles that they had created beside the organic fencing that they began with. It seems as though, because we have so much stone wall here in New England, and have had for such a long time, that it must have been built up over many generations. In fact, this is not true. We acquired our stone walls, historically speaking, in an enormously short period of time. One estimate says that the bulk of them were built in about a 50-year period between perhaps about 1775 and 1825. And for northern New England, the part that I come from, where settling happened just a little bit later, and the development of the landscape moved along a little bit more slowly. That time frame is even shorter. It runs in about a 30-year stretch from perhaps 1810 to about 1840. And there were a number of reasons why all of a sudden New England farmers by the thousands began to build stone walls almost in what's been described as a kind of frenzy. One of them was the advent of what has been now dubbed the sheep craze, which came into being after 1810 when a new breed of very productive sheep came to this country, the Merinos, and began to make a lot of farmers rich. Down here in Massachusetts, certainly, and very much so in the northern hillier parts of New England as well. And so everyone got into the sheep business all at once. This caused enormous amounts of land to have to be enclosed because sheep need to be inside boundaries, or else they'll just wander all over the countryside and you can't tell whose is whose. And so this combination of great success in terms of the small-scale agriculture that New England became famous for, and also the advent of the sheep craze, caused huge amounts of land to suddenly be enclosed. This was also responsible for the beginning of the professionalization of this craft, which had formerly, at least in the beginning, been done almost entirely by those who owned the property on which these walls were being built. After about 1810, however, you began to see gangs of men moving around the countryside, making deals with farmers to put up such and such an amount of wall in such and such a time for such and such a price. This had a large effect on the beginning of the development of different styles of stone walls. One of the things that distinguishes New England stone walls is the enormous variety that they have in terms of the ways that they are put together, and also the ways that they look. Whether that variety reflects the actuality of their building techniques is another story. However, there is something about New England walls that is not homogeneous in terms of the way walls in other parts of the world where dry stonework is common are found. We are characterized by an enormous amount of let's say, personal preference in terms of the way these walls appear once they're built. This frenzy of wall building does not mean that occurred in a relatively short historical period of time. Doesn't mean that no stone walls were built before, say, 1775, and none were built after 1840 or so. Only that the bulk of them, on a volume basis, was certainly completed during the course of that time. So it was actually a fairly short historical moment that gave us most of what we still have today. As I said before, by the time we get to the latter part of the 19th century, however, New England agriculture was no longer the great success that it had been in the early part of the 19th century, and this happened for a large number of very complicated factors, including improvements in transportation, the coming of the railroad, the building of the Erie Canal, things that allowed agriculture from other parts of the country to compete with the New England markets in a way that was detrimental to those who were farming right here at home. And so New England agriculture began to decline fairly precipitously, especially after the Civil War, when not only did we lose thousands of young farmers, and some older ones too in the war itself, but in which a great many New England farmers discovered that there are parts of this country where the topsoil is 6 feet deep, not 6 inches deep, and so came home just long enough to throw a shovel in the wagon and move on to Missouri or Ohio or someplace where farming did not seem like an act of desperation or insanity in rocky old New England. This precipitated the enormous and wholesale abandonment of thousands and thousands of small hill farms, especially here in New England. And it began the process of what has been called the Great New England Depression. One of the things that's interesting about the Department of Agriculture report is its timing, not just what it says, because 1871, as I said, is about as close as you're going to come to an exact year when New England farming really began to disappear as a primary enterprise of the people living here. All kinds of things happened to exacerbate it. Not least among them, of course, was the establishment of the mill towns, places like Haverhill and of course Lowell and Lawrence and Manchester and many others, which drew labor off the farms and made it easy for people to abandon those old tough homesteads up in the hills. When that happened, the process of reforestation simply began to take hold with incredible speed. And by the time, of course, the report was released, many thousands of acres of formerly productive farmland were fast running back to fallow and running back to wilderness, and with them the walls that had defined those farms and that still continue to stand even as the woods grew back up around them. This process of the decline of New England became a serious problem here, and it was they tried to combat it in various ways. They created the institution, for instance, known as Old Home Day, to try and lure people back into the area. One thing that's great about Old Home Day, especially in my part of the world, up in New Hampshire, is that although it was invented by a New Hampshire governor with the intention of bringing especially younger people back to revitalize the New England economy, it was a complete failure. It didn't do that job at all. On the other hand, the people of New Hampshire thought Old Home Day was a swell thing. And so even though it was a complete failure, we have kept it and honored it ever since. I find this quixotic in a very defining New England way, that we have managed to hold on to something that was such an utter failure of its original purpose simply because we liked it. New England's great long decline lasted into the middle of, believe it or not, what we now call the Great Depression. Some people have said that the Depression was good for New England. My own parents, who lived through the Depression and the war that followed, would not take this view, but it is possible to interpret the Depression as having done something for poor old downtrodden New England that it really needed to have done. And that was, it dragged the rest of the country down to the same level where New England had already been for 50 or 60 years, and thus even the playing field, and made it possible for New England to start to bounce back. And it did bounce back by beginning to market itself and think about itself as a kind of heritage place, as a place that was healthy to live, that had rich history, that had all kinds of advantages in terms of what it was like simply to be here. It's not an accident, for instance, that the Voice of New England, Yankee Magazine, began to publish right in the middle of the Great Depression. It sent its first issue out in 1935. Or that things like the ski industry or the summer theater industry began to take off in the middle of the Depression. This was the time when we began to realize that we had some potential as a tourist place, as a place that was attractive for people to come and spend money in who didn't necessarily live here. Those ideas all came, at least in part, from the long decline that had begun in the post-Civil War years and had lasted well into the 20th century. Now, why am I talking about all this in a lecture about stone walls? Because with the abandonment of all that land and the farming places that had gone along with it, the forces of redevelopment, which never did manage to start to reestablish themselves until the Depression was well underway, never had a chance to come in and replace the old agricultural structures or the disposition of land that had been laid out in the 17th and 18th centuries. That meant that thousands and thousands of miles of stone walls and other things that had been built up over the course of that 150 or 200 year period remained in place. And so the Great Long Depression of New England actually acted as a kind of preservative for many older structures and gave us the chance to see an awful lot of the older work, particularly in stone, preserved as the forest grew up around it, and although it certainly did suffer some deterioration that way, also managed to remain in place. That is the reason why of those long ago 250,000 plus miles of stone walls, we still have so many with us today. Now, how are these stone walls put together? There is, for you Star Trek fans, a prime directive in stone wall building. It is this. When you are building in dry stone and you want your structure to stay together for a little bit longer than a day or two, you must place one stone over two. Here's my sole physical demonstration. You must place one stone over two or two over one. In other words, as you begin to stack up stones of different kinds, you want to make sure to break the joints between individual stones with the stones that follow. In other words, to crosshatch everything you're building so that it has multiple physical dependencies in order to stay in place. In other words, do not do this. Piling stones directly on top of one another. This has a name. It's called stack bonding, and it is bad because it separates the structure of the wall into discrete segments that can be taken apart and will fall apart sooner or later. Now, stone walls have a kind of reputation as being things that are still and things that stay put once they're in place, don't they? But the fact is that stone walls are in a state of constant motion. It's just motion that you can't always see. This is because of fact number 2 you must always remember. Think about our stone walls. Every stone in the world has an ambition, personal ambition, to sink to the center of the earth as soon as possible. It is extraordinarily consistent and insistent, I guess I could say, about this ambition. It will follow it seemingly instantly if given any chance at any time. And how is it that it gets a chance to fulfill this ambition? How is it that stone walls are in a state of constant motion? Well, if you could see a time-lapse film of an old stone wall taken over, say, 150 years, you'd see something that reminded you of the moment after you turn a rock over in your garden that has an ant nest under it. That one little moment before the ants all panic and run in different directions. And this kind of stirring that goes through the entire colony. This is what stone walls would look like if you could see time sped up sufficiently to see how it passes and how stone walls react to the things that happen to them. And all kinds of things happen to stone walls once they're in place. You know, we have earthquakes here in New England. We just, a couple of years ago in October, we had that massive 4.0 monster over in the Maine-New Hampshire border. But there are many other things that happen to stone walls as well. Water changes its course underneath them. Frost heaves heave up a little bit and then relax in the spring. Tree branches fall across them. Tree roots grow underneath them and heave them up and then drop them back down. There are all kinds of negative environmental influences that are at work on stone walls all the time. And every time one of them does its little business, for instance, as that little earthquake rolled across New Hampshire, every stone and every wall went, hey, 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 this is my chance. I can get a little closer to the ground right now. And if there was any space around that stone, in any wall, it managed to move into that space and get a little bit lower. That meant that the wall would spread out a little bit. Other stones would be deprived of their support by the movement of a single one, and therefore the effects of that tiny cataclysm would be felt throughout the wall. It might be that a stone that was badly placed, or one that had lost some of its support from previous movements, finally lost enough so that it could get squeezed out of the wall altogether and simply fell off the wall. This is the process by which the old stone walls deteriorate and eventually fall down. We think of them as permanent things, don't we? But the truth is that all stone walls are prone to deterioration over time, and eventually, no matter how well built they are, all of them begin to fall down sooner or later. That's why they need regular maintenance. So this process of stone walls coming apart is a thing that cannot be entirely avoided, but the techniques of building are meant to allow you to forestall it as long as possible. And this is where the cross-hatching and creating relationships, physical relationships among individual stones within the wall, so that no stone is solely dependent on a single other stone in order to hold its position. It's dependent on several others. You can do this not only by how you place individual stones, but also how you place subsequent stones on top of them. It isn't just the position of the stone itself sitting in its spot that helps hold it in place. It's also all the other stones around it. This is why stone walls, when they're being built, You have to be extremely careful to get the proportion of height to width correct. This is a critical component of why they hold themselves together. There are actually two major kinds of stone walls, and two only. Even though dry stone structures assume a large variety of shapes and forms, they're all variations of either one or the other of these two types. And those types are the freestanding wall and the retainer. Freestanding walls rise into the ground on both sides and show what we call faces, in other words, the outside of the wall, the part you can see, on both front and back. Retaining walls mark the difference between two different grades of ground, one higher and one lower, obviously, and they rise into space on only one side. The other side, of course, is backed up against a bank and frequently buried right in the middle of it. What distinguishes these two types from each other in terms of their building is the proportion of width to height that is necessary in order for them to hold themselves together. In freestanding walls, that proportion is about 1 to 3/4. What that means is that if you are proposing to build a freestanding wall that's 6 feet tall, you have to make sure that its footprint, its base, in other words, the part of it that touches the ground, is at least 4 feet wide. That is 3/4 of the 6, that is its height. This means that there will be enough bulk within the wall for it to develop those multiple dependencies on a stone-by-stone basis that I was talking about that will help hold it together. If it's too thin, it will react much more quickly to the negative stimuli of earthquakes and water damage and tree roots and so on than it will if it's a little bit bulkier, so that there's a lot more stone crushing down on its various individual members and helping to hold them in place. For retaining walls, that proportion is even more radical. It begins at 1 to 1 and gets even higher. We once restored an old carriage house foundation that had been carrying a 2-story building on it and had in its basement area foundation walls that were about 8 feet high. Let's pretend that my fingertips and my elbow is at 8 feet. And this would be the outside face, in other words, the inside of the cellar of this building. We were going to restore this foundation, and when you restore something, you have to take the whole thing apart and put it back together from scratch. So when we took this wall apart, we discovered that behind this face, this 8-foot tall face, was more than 12 feet of carefully laid stone in the footprint of the foundation. So it extended back more than 1.5 times its actual original height in order to create this enormous bulk of stone. Now, had it been a freestanding wall, it would have been that wide all the way. But it was built the way the old-timers used to build their foundations and other retaining walls, and that is as a kind of dam. And so, though it was 12 feet wide at its footprint at the base, it got narrower and narrower as it came up. There was a kind of hypotenuse to it, until it got to the top, where the sills of the building had been lying, and there it was only about 18 inches wide. Now, why did they build it like this? The thing about retaining walls is that they not only have to hold themselves up, but they also have to hold back whatever pressure is coming from the settling of the fill on their back side. And so this is why they are built like dams, because in the case of this particular retaining wall, the pressure from the settling fill on the outside of its bulk meant that there was constant pressure down and in from the settling of that fill. It meant that the stone wall itself not only had to hold its own bulk together and maintain its own height, but it also had to maintain itself against the pressure of the soil on the back side, a thing that freestanding walls, of course, do not have to do. That is one of the reasons, the main reason, why those old-fashioned retaining walls were built so heavily. And it's one of the funny things that's been lost in the contemporary applications of this craft, too. You think a little bit about some of the shorter retaining walls you may have seen around town or in other places where you've been. If you've ever seen a retaining wall, a short one or a fairly tall one, is tipping over like this, beginning to slide forward from the top. you can be virtually certain that the reason that is happening is because it was not built thickly enough in back of the part that you can see. If you put that heavy footprint in back of a retaining wall, that is what prevents the fill behind from pushing over the wall. If it's too thin, or it's just built straight up and down, it's almost inevitable that it will eventually tip out and fall down. And it's funny that this should be one of the main things that's been lost about the old craft of building these walls, because it's one of the most obvious ones in terms of building a structure that is going to hold itself together. People are getting a little bit better about that nowadays, but there are still plenty of retaining walls around that look as though they're in trouble relatively early in their lives. And so that's there's a great deal that can be said about the techniques of building, and I'm going to let you take me back to anything that I have skipped or missed or not elaborated enough on just in a few minutes. But right now I want to talk just briefly about the ways that New England stone walls began to change and develop over time. As they first were built by farmers mostly, the primary purpose was to create a kind of barrier, and that was really it. Stone walls became something rather more important than merely barrier fairly quickly in their life. But at the beginning, farmers weren't very worried about how their walls looked, as long as they functioned in the way that they intended them to function. After we got past the earlier part of the 19th century, however, stone walls began to become something of a symbol of good and correct farming. This was commented on by people such as Noah Webster, the dictionary maker, who was also a famous curmudgeon, by the way. He remarked once that sloppy or carelessly built stone walls on a farm indicated that the farmer himself was guilty of laziness or sloth or both. And so the symbolism of stone walls became something that asserted itself almost immediately as a way to identify the good and careful farmers and separate them from the lazy ones, or the ones who took too many shortcuts. This phenomenon still shows itself in some of the old walls that we see even today. As you may have noticed, if you've been traveling around the countryside a little bit, that if you pass by a place where an old homestead has stood or used to stand for many years, and there were lots of walls associated with this homestead around and about the place, you'll almost certainly notice that the ones that are nearest the center of the homestead, in other words where the house was or the barns, are put together rather more carefully and have about them a more regular look. The stones in them are more carefully selected rather than simply used as they came to hand. And the laying of those stones is done quite a bit more carefully, whereas if you move out into the countryside, the outer limits of this mythical homestead we're talking about, you'll see that the walls become considerably rougher. The story of the development of style in New England walls is really a story about selection versus simply using everything that came to hand. And it became fancier and fancier in many places as the century went on. This was helped by the change in the way that stone can be split and cut up into usable pieces, which occurred in the about 1830 with the introduction of what we now call the feathered wedge system. That system of splitting is the one that leaves those little half-finger-sized holes on the edges of pieces of rough granite you may have seen. It's a system that calls on you to drill a line of little holes in a stone that you're going to split, and then drive tiny steel wedges into each one of those holes in turn in order to split the stone into shapes that you can use. And that system didn't come into being until the middle of the 19th century, and therefore nothing that was built that way can have existed before about 1830 or so. It's one of the very few ways that we have of dating older stonework, which is virtually impossible to date on the basis of its appearance, other than in ways like that. The change of styles in New England stone wall building was also accompanied by changes in the way that the land on which those walls sat was used. In the post-Civil War era, we began to see people using parts of New England as vacation or tourist places. And that process began well before the states got hip enough to start marketing it, as they did after the Great Depression. Rich people from the cities began to buy up old farms and use them for their so-called summer cottages. Really in the middle of the 19th century, this movement began. And when they did that, they began to bring workers in from elsewhere. Many of them were immigrants, Greeks, Italians, Irish, who had long traditions of dry stone wall building from their own cultures, and proceeded to bring some of those techniques and some of those looks to parts of New England where they were being employed to build stonework. Their work has now blended in with the older farmer work and become part of the landscape. They are responsible for lots and lots of places in New England that we think of as New England places, such as, for instance, Castle in the Clouds up in Ossipee, New Hampshire, you may have heard of. Or some of the old estates like the Fells in Newbury, and there are, I believe, some in the Berkshires as well, where they were, for instance, Edith Wharton's old place is a good example, where the Shakespeare and Company, theater company out in Lenox is now. That's one of those old summer estates too. The styles that were brought there by those who did stonework on places such as that were quite different, much more careful. The main thing that separates them from the farmer style was their attitude toward the stone itself. The old farmer style is recognizable because the old farmers had something more in mind than just what they wanted the stone wall to do whenever they built one. Their secondary objective in virtually every case was to use up as much stone as possible, because the point of it all was to get it off the ground so that they could continue to farm. And as I was saying before, because their activities precipitated so much erosion, especially in hilly places, they were responsible for New England getting stonier and stonier as time went on. So their struggles to evict all this stone from their properties was sort of doomed from the start. Nonetheless, a great many New England walls look the way they do, not so much because of any sense of formal design on the part of those who built them, but because it was necessary for them to use up as much stone as they could possibly manage to get moved off the place. That is why so much older farmer-style New England stonework is often so much larger than it needs to be. There are plenty of places where you'll see walls in between fields, for instance, that are 12, 15, 18, 20 feet wide. Widths that are not necessary at all in terms of what the job of the wall was supposed to be, but widths that were developed over many years as more and more stone came out of those fields and had to be put somewhere and ended up in the walls. This is also true, of course, of the ramps leading into the upper levels of barns, in many places to the stone linings that were used in wells, to the enormous bulk that is put into the back sides of foundations, of course, with that great wide footprint I was talking about before. And virtually every kind of older New England structure is dependent on that great mass of stone that had to be moved and put into it, not so much to create the structure, but to get rid of stone as much as possible. There's another type of New England wall as well, a kind of subtype. This is the famous single stack wall. The single stack wall has one great attribute, and that is that it's only one stone wide. It is a type of wall that you might think would be ridiculous to build in a place where your primary purpose, or one of your primary purposes, is to get rid of as much stone as you possibly can. Why on earth would you build a type of wall that requires the least amount of stone possible in order to do its job? The answer to that question is speed. Because the single stack wall emerged at a time when New England farmers were trying desperately to enclose as much land as they possibly could, they began to use this style in the early part of the 19th century, and it became a favored style for two things: for the walls that run along roads and for creating boundaries. The reason was that a crew of men with a ready access to stone and the skills to do it could put up many, many feet of a single stack wall in a single day. Whereas other types of walls that are more formal and more careful take a whole lot longer. We acquired thousands and thousands of miles of single stack walls during the course of the sheep craze alone, and many more after that too, as new areas of land were broken out. But you can see that even on this little tiny scale, I can build a relatively representative single stack wall much, much faster than I can do a double-faced, tightly fitted wall here. So this process of increasing sophistication in the way walls were put together and the increasing selection of stones, rather than the random use of everything that came to hand, really began to distinguish styles in the latter part of the 19th century from the agricultural style that had preceded it and that had been responsible for so many thousands of miles of our old stone walls. You can see when you look at any given stone wall, whether it belongs to the farmer tradition or to a fancier later tradition, simply by looking at the stones that are in the wall themselves. Any wall that seems to be built of stones of all kinds of random sizes, from stones as large as one of those little tiny cars they have now to stones no bigger than a softball. If you see that kind of range of sizes in a wall, you're probably looking at something that's fairly old. If, however, you see that stones in a particular stone wall are all roughly the same size, or if they're matched in other ways, such as their squareness or their rectangularness or some other thing that unites them all so that they appear to be relatively homogeneous in shape and size, then you're looking at a wall in which the stones were fairly carefully selected. In other words, stones that fit that mold were used, and those that did not were either discarded or never brought to the job in the first place. This is quite different from the attitude that built the old agricultural work early on, when one of the goals was to get rid of as much stone as possible, not to carefully select from it and throw other stone away. And so not only the vacationing rich industrialists and their professional crews were responsible for some of these changes in style, but also various movements that swept through New England during the course of the latter half of the 19th century. The so-called colonial revival movement, for instance, which was an effort to spiff up New England, to fix up its town greens, to put nice pretty little stone walls around its town cemeteries, to just generally improve the appearance of the entire region. This became rather a thing in the latter part of the 19th and early part of the 20th century. It's the time, for instance, when we decided that all New England buildings had to be white in order to reflect the Republican values of the Roman Empire and the Greek revival, so-called. It's the time when various civic groups, you would take credit for doing things like spiffing up the town pound, perhaps putting a nice wall around the principal cemetery in the center of town, or cleaning up the mud hole that had been previously known as the town common and giving it something, a look that could be pointed to with pride by those who lived in the town. This movement went on for quite some time, from the latter decades of the 19th century well into the 20th. And sometimes you see little plaques, for instance, on the town pound, restored by the Civic Club, 1928, that sort of thing. Another example of ways that styles changed came in the form of various architectural movements, such as the arts and crafts period and the shingle style of building homes, which all came with their own special way of handling stonework to go right along with the changes in architectural style. So there's a kind of constant reflection in a lot of New England stonework of prevailing attitudes toward architectural building of one kind or another. The shingle style, of course, was going on during the early decades of the 20th century, and was responsible for several little innovations. By then, of course, the science of making mortar had improved. You know, one of the reasons that stone walls were not mortared together much in the 19th century was because mortar, as we knew it then, wasn't very good, especially for stone. But they improved it in the early part of the 20th, and so it began to be used more and more, especially in urban areas. The shingle style of building was accompanied sometimes by that famous pebble style of putting stones together. You were telling me about the guy who built an entire wall with tiny little hand-sized stones. Had he put that together out of river rock or some other very smooth type of stone and mortared it, it would have looked a lot like the sort of shingle style arts and crafts stone building that used mortar and would make, say, the pillars and foundations of a porch out in front of the house out of that type of stone. Many, many, many tiny little stones, all carefully mortared together. These are sort of variations on a theme, if you will, of the New England attitude toward building in stone, and they really helped to diversify the look of the stonework that we see throughout New England. Now I want to talk to you just briefly, for those of you who simply can't get enough about what's in some of these other books. There are two books here that function as general histories of New England stonework. This is the first. It is, to me, still the finest one that's out there. It is Sermons in Stone by Susan Allport. It's about 22 years old now. It's an easy read. It is short, and it covers all the territory that I've been talking to you about, and then some, right up to the present day in a very succinct and efficient way. This book covers the same territory. It's a younger book. It's about 10 years old. It was written by a geologist from the University of Connecticut named Robert Thorson. And his book is notable because he himself is a geologist, and therefore he's very, very good on how we got all the stone we have, what the geological foundations of our stonework are. And he's possibly somewhat less helpful in the category of discussing the building itself, since he himself is not a builder. And so he's a little eccentric on that, but we can forgive him for it because his geology is so good. There are zillions of books about stone, using stone in the garden. This is one of the best ones. It's by Gordon Hayward, a garden designer from Vermont. And this book is one of my current favorites, not just because there's a profile of me in it, but because it is such a good book for people who love our old stone walls, appreciate them, want to know more about what they are seeing when they look at them and so forth. You can see it's very well worn. I'm going to leave it open to this particular picture, which I know you cannot see, but I can't help holding it up for you anyway. This is just one of Mr. Hubble. This book was written and photographed by a man named Bill Hubble from Maine. He has managed to find and photograph virtually every kind of dry stonework there is in New England. And his book is tremendously valuable for that alone. If you want to appreciate and understand the types of things that have been built out of dry stone here, and how they have fared over time, and how they look now, and how to recognize them, this is a book that's essential for you. But he has another picture in here. This is a picture of a tiny little parcel of acreage in upstate New York somewhere. This picture makes it clearer than any amount of chattering on my part or anybody else's part could make it, how it was that we ended up with so much stonework throughout the Northeast region. You know, somebody who became fascinated with that 250,000 mile figure and with the things that were not included in it once calculated that there is more dry stonework in the Northeast United States than there is in the entire rest of the world combined on a volume basis. The reason we don't appreciate it is because so much of it is underneath our houses and hidden in the woods. If you could see it all together, you would realize that the labor that went into it would have built the pyramids of Egypt 100 times over. We have done something as far as a communal reordering of the landscape here in New England that is of gargantuan proportions. And yet it's so ordinary and humble by its nature. There's nothing about it that's tremendously spectacular, that it goes unnoticed for what it really is. This little stretch of acreage is very small, and yet the old pattern of 1 and 3 acre fields is perfectly preserved in it by the outline of the stone walls that you can see. And the picture was taken a part of the year when there were no leaves on the trees. So if you look down into this little tiny area of land, see all the pattern of walls all over it, you'll not be surprised by that 250,000 plus mile figure in terms of the region as a whole. This is the only book in my little collection that is out of print. It is not concerned with New England in any way. It was written by a Swiss architect named Werner Blaser, and one of its many charms is that it is simultaneously printed in English, French, and German, for those of you who want to brush up on your European languages. It treats various sites in Europe where there is truly spectacular and ancient dry stonework, including the Aran Islands off the coast of Ireland and some little villages at the base of the Italian Alps, where entire buildings are built of dry laid stone, walls and roof. Would you like to go to sleep under a roof of boulders in an earthquake-prone region? Well, they do, and some of these structures are truly incredible to look at, though somewhat scary. Now, the time has come for you to tell me what you'd really like to know. Yes, sir.
Well, I was just going to comment that and this is a comment and then a question. My dad was a stonemason, and stonemasons go back 8 generations in my family, so it's a long thing. To Germany, and so when I was in Germany for the first time, I began to see these wonderful cathedrals and these wonderful bridges, and I never really honestly, and this is, I guess, what I was going to ask you, I used to stand underneath these bridges and look at them and think about what it took to get those stones in place, and the beauty of this process. And the fact that these are all dry stone, I would gather.
Most of them are, yes.
Yeah.
It's true.
And likewise, the cathedrals, I would assume many of them are, if not dry stone, primarily dry stone.
Yes, so much. The use of mortar was so limited in those structures. It was mostly about cutting and fitting.
Yeah.
They might as well be dry in most cases, yeah.
And the other thing I was going to comment on is that, and New England does this quite a bit, is that throughout all the villages of Germany and Switzerland and every place that we went, that we were aware of, there are laws that prohibit the replacement of an historic stone structure by anything less than that. Yeah. And it's a wonderful process. I really enjoyed it. But I enjoyed your talk so much, and the fact that you can do all this while you're is really remarkable.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to be in a place where this kind of these kind of simple tributes to our understanding of art and architecture and so forth are really great.
I want to elaborate on something that you brought up with your heritage and the fact that the stonemasons of your family are from Germany, and this is a question that I sometimes get asked and might be asked here, but I'll preempt it anyway. And that is, why don't we have more stone houses here in New England, given the incredible availability of material to build them with? For instance, if you go down to the Hudson River Valley or into parts of Pennsylvania, where German settlement in the 18th and 19th centuries was more predominant than the English settlement that dominated here, you see all kinds of stone houses and barns in the Hudson River Valley and other places a little bit south and west of here, but not so much here. And the reason is because the English settlers who came here were timber framers by trade and by inclination. And so they tended to get their building materials out of the forest, and by the time they began to be serious about building in stone, they didn't have the traditions you spoke about that came with them for that type of building. So although we could have been a place full of delightful stone buildings, houses, barns, every kind of building, we didn't end up that way. This is one of those accidents of the confluence of culture and history that happens in particular places.
Winnicott Castle, however, is.
There are always exceptions. It's not that there are no stone buildings here, but what we don't have is many of them.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
What started your interest and piqued your interest in this?
Well, I come from a fairly long line of odd people who do more than one thing. You probably saw that in my own intro, that I'm just another one of those guys who can't keep a steady job. But I have an uncle who has been a farmer, a lifelong New Hampshire farmer. And he was taught to build dry stone walls in the old traditional way by men of the generation before his. He taught me in the early 70s, and we began to do it together, and at that time, not every landscaper up and down the block was claiming that they could build stone walls, and so we had a kind of little specialty thing that we began, like good New Hampshire farmers, to exploit as much as possible. And so we got known for it a little bit in the late 70s and through the 80s and 90s. I've always had a temperament that enjoyed it. Not everybody does. Some people find this the most excruciating, deadly bore that could ever exist. Others are fascinated by it and become interested in putting shapes together and seeing what kinds of structures can be built. My own special interest is in taking apart old things and putting them back together and attempting to imitate the styles that I see in things that I'm restoring. And for some reason I've found a great interest in doing it, so I kept with it. It was an accident of family, as so many things are. Yes?
How do farmers have the time for this? I mean, it was a necessity,
This is a really
but
good question.
it's very
Yeah.
labor intensive, and
Yes.
so it just seems like,
Stone wall building's a funny thing in New England because it doesn't have a season. You know,
No.
haying has a season, slaughtering has a season, growing things have seasons. Stone wall building has to happen in the spaces in between. And there are spaces in between when everything is planted but it hasn't grown yet, for instance. When all the slaughtering is done but it hasn't snowed yet, and you know the hay is in for the winter and so forth. And so stone wall building occupies those interior spaces. And it doesn't happen all at once either. We know that it happened in stages in many places because farmers often would stockpile stone in various places on their property in order to use at a later time. And if they went off to war and got shot to pieces in the Civil War, or if their sons all went to work in Manchester and did not keep up the farm and it was abandoned, some of those stockpiles of stone were left in place. And indeed, some of the ongoing wall projects that they were working on at the time that they left the farm or something else happened, you can still find plenty of walls out in the woods that go along and look like they're doing perfectly fine. They just sort of drift away, peter out, and disappear. There's a thing I left out about the year of 1871 too that's equally significant, and that is the invention of barbed wire, which occurred in 1868, just before this report was issued. The combination of the abandonment of land, the loss of labor in upland farms, the substitution of wire for the much more labor-intensive stone walls, was all part of the complicated way that stone wall building as a widespread activity came to an end here in New England. But to fit it in and manage to build as much as they did, in between the other things that were necessary for them to do, is really only part of the amazing story of how much of this dry stone work we ended up with. It had to be a thing that they pursued at virtually every waking moment that was free in order to build as much as they did.
You notice in Rhode Island, the dry laid stone walls are very much fitted together beautifully, and flat sides.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it seems characteristic of the east, well, of what I've seen in Rhode Island, which is mostly along the coastline.
Mm-hmm.
And is there a particular reason for that? It's the
Yes, it's
kind of
just-
stone that they have?
Yes, it's partly that. Parts of Rhode Island, Connecticut have a lot of shale or slaty type of very flat stone that makes a particular kind of closely fitted looking wall. The other reason, of course, is that the Italian influence on wall building in Connecticut and Rhode Island is rather vast. Italian immigrants who were expert stonemasons got to Rhode Island and Connecticut fairly soon, especially in the mid-years of the 19th century. And their work really had a big influence on the way that those walls often look. But that more careful mason style is the work of professionals too. And remember that the bulk of the older agricultural work in our region was the work that uses everything and uses the great big ugly misshapen stuff. That's largely the work of what we would now call amateurs, people who did it because they knew how, but not because it was their profession. And that's quite distinguishable, as you're pointing out, from work done by professionals, from other traditions that were a little more careful than the kind of rough and ready New England one. So we've got a mixture of all that sort of thing.
I've noticed this wall, not too many of them, but, and it's obviously a professional wall, and it's mortared. But then they put on end, the top of the wall of,
Yes, there's a name for that.
oh, is there?
Yes, it's this, isn't it? Are you talking about this kind of look
Yeah.
when they're on the edge?
Oh, I usually see just one row.
That's
but
right.
that
This
looks like
one's
it's
this
two.
one's got
Yeah.
a triple row,
Yeah.
but it's called coping.
Okay.
A wall that has a bunch of flat ones set on edge, so it looks like a shelf of books leaning slightly, is a wall that has been coped.
And that one is dry laid?
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
Oh yeah, yeah. Coping does something great if you have enough flat stones to do it. One of the reasons we don't see very much of it, except in places like Rhode Island and parts of Vermont, is because we just don't have that much slaty flat stuff in most parts of New England. But coping extends the height of the wall without using all that much bulk, especially when all the stones are flat and thin. If you laid them flat down like plates, you'd have to put an awful lot of them to get the same height that you get when you just lay them on their edge, up on the top of the wall, like this, except in a whole bunch of. So it's helpful that way, but we simply don't have enough of the material to do that in most parts of the world.
I always thought the Romans had mortar, so you're saying all
They
those
did.
aqueducts
Oh,
were
yes.
dry laid?
Many of them are, but many are not.
Okay.
The Romans did have mortar, and they had a form of concrete that was far
So
superior
we
to what
lost
we
that
have now.
expertise in the Middle Ages?
Well, it's their concrete, I understand, was made using an ingredient that was volcanic, that came out of the area of Vesuvius, that created incredibly long-lasting concrete that we somehow cannot duplicate to this day. But you know, there are buildings in Rome, for instance, the Pantheon, the famous building that has the hole in the ceiling. That entire conical roof is made of concrete. It's not stone. And it's 2,000 years old. Can you imagine the Department of Transportation getting its hands on concrete that lasted beautifully for 2 years? They can't even make a bridge that lasts 20 years, right? This is 2,000-year-old concrete that's in perfect condition. So there's something been lost, that's for sure.
And really the cathedrals have no mortar in them? The European cathedrals have?
I believe that they often do have mortar, but it's extremely thin, and it's an old kind of mortar called lime mortar. It doesn't have much stick to it. All it does is take up the space between stones. So on a structural basis, because it's not really gluing them together, it's just filling the space so they have a flat place to sit. Structurally, those buildings are essentially dry laid.
Well, there's also in brick, early 19th century.
Absolutely.
The wafer thin.
That's right.
Mortar joints, which is just beautiful, but
You're
you hardly
absolutely
ever
right.
see it.
No, that skill has been completely lost. But also now the mortar that we use has Portland cement in it, and it sticks much
Yeah.
better.
Yeah.
In the old days, you know, most of Boston is built this way, paper-thin joints between bricks. those buildings are essentially standing as dry laid brick. The mortar just takes up a space and lets the brick sit flat.
Not the air from going through.
If you took a section of those out and just tapped it with a hammer, those bricks would come right apart. They'd be very easy to clean. The mortar's all very soft and crumbly now. So most of those on the cathedrals in Europe too are sitting there. But the size of the pieces of the carved pieces of stone that makes up those cathedrals is huge,
Yeah.
right? And gigantic. And the larger pieces of stone are, the more stable they are. What else can I tell you?
How high do you get the single stack walls?
You can get these to 4 or 5 feet if you start big enough at the bottom. One of the interesting things about single stacks is that you lose a little width with every course because they're really just balanced.
Okay, so
You know,
start
they're much
wide at
more
the bottom.
fragile, that's right. You may have noticed that they totally violate the rule I was telling you about the relationship of width to height. Their only virtue is speed in construction. And it's interesting because we've been in business building stone walls for people now for 40 years. When we started, nobody cared about the single stacks. They were regarded as sort of remnants of the past. And in the last, I'd say, 7 or 8 years, people have begun to really notice them and ask them to be restored. And to, well, I've rebuilt several just in the last 4 or 5 years. So people have a kind of new appreciation for them. I think one of the reasons why they haven't made much impression is because they fall down so easily that most of them throughout the region are only about 2 or 3 feet high now, and so they have no real impact as walls. But they can and were built to heights of 4 and 5 feet when they were expected to keep livestock in. There was a law in the state of Connecticut at the end of the 18th century that mandated a 4 to 4.5 foot height for any wall, built of stone or not, that was going to be expected to contain or keep livestock out. And it's funny because you know we have developed over the years a kind of expectation about what is familiar to us in the New England landscape. And one of those expectations is of deterioration, of a certain form of genteel deterioration. We have gone more than once to speak to clients about what they would like to see in the wall they're asking us to build, and been asked this: please don't make it look too nice. Is this the thing you would ask to somebody who's redoing your kitchen? Please don't make it look too nice? But we know what they mean. They don't want it to look too new, fussy, modern, carefully put together. And so we've actually had to teach ourselves how to build stone walls that are structurally sound in reality, but appear to be about to fall down. This is unique in the history of building as far as I'm concerned. But it is part of it's part of what makes us comfortable about what we see in New England. Because so much of New England is still this essentially abandoned, soft farmland that is defined in many cases by the contrast of walls and open field and woods beyond. It's the look that we are used to seeing, and it's the look we prefer to see. I went 2 years ago and restored the single stack, 500 feet of single stack that was running along the front line of a wonderful couple's property. And I put it back to the height that it would have been when it was first built. 2 weeks after I completed it, the client called me and said, "I want you to come back and take a foot of height off the wall." And it's because he couldn't get used to the height that it was. It looked wrong to him, even though it was authentic, historically speaking. And I perfectly understood why. It just wasn't the same as what he'd been used to looking at over all those years. So you have to be careful. We get used to things around here. And we want to see what we're used to.
So the walls you build today are still dry laying?
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's our particular business. We've done some wet work, but I wouldn't call us expert.
Even as retaining walls?
Oh, sure. Oh, yes. Dry stone is extremely good as retaining walls. It's a
So the
little,
water
actually a
goes
little
in.
better than mortared work, and the reason is because it passes all the water that
Mhm.
can accumulate behind it. Mortared dry walls are true dams. I mean, mortar retaining walls are true dams, and they will hold the water behind them to the point where they often bury pipes in them, which we call weeps, to let the water pass out so that it won't build up behind the stonework and then soak into it and then freeze and pry it all apart. We had a client once when we built a great big dry retaining wall for her, and she insisted that we put weeps in it, in a dry retaining wall. I know. We tried to avoid laughing in her face when she said this, but my uncle, who cannot avoid sarcastic responses from time to time, asked her, "How is the water going to know to go in the pipes?"
My house is on an old horse farm,
Uh-huh.
I mean, at one time, and, there are stone walls, it's retaining walls, not on my property, but on what, next lot. And they are all mortared, so, but it was something of a fancy estate, I guess, so I suppose it was put there.
I think you're putting your finger on it.
Mhm.
Yeah. Mortared work around here is probably not much older than, say, the 1920s at best. It's hard to
Well,
be
the house would
absolutely
have been
specific.
1890s or earlier.
Oh, sure, but you know,
Yeah.
anything can be built
Yeah.
at any time. And it's also possible that those walls began as dry walls and became mortared walls
Well,
later.
further down
This
the road,
happens.
it's just dry lane,
Yeah.
and then between
Mhm.
the lots, it's a dry lane wall, which is
Sure.
interesting.
We've got
to me.
quite a mixture of pretty much everything around here by now. You know, a lot of different things have happened at different periods of history. I'll give you one good example. There's in the 20s and early 30s, when it became obvious that we were going to start driving cars everywhere instead of horses and buggies, they sent road crews up and down most of the old dirt roads in the region to grade them out and make them passable by automobile traffic, right? Which they weren't before. One of the things that they had to do when they were doing that was dig out the whalebacks in these old dirt roads. A whaleback is a stone that's embedded in a dirt road except for a kind of hump, you know, almost like a whale just breaching the surface just a little bit. In horse and buggies days, these didn't matter because you're going so slow and you can go around them, and the carriage is higher on a buggy anyway, so you can usually go over them, but they're deaf to cars. They just, you go airborne, they hit the muffler, you know. And so they began to dig these whalebacks out. Now this is the late 20s and early 30s. By then they had the beginning of heavy machinery. They had some steam shovels and grading engines and that sort of thing. So they would take these giant boulders out, and every once in a while, when they were feeling humorous or bored to tears or something, they would pluck these boulders up with their chains and drop them right in the middle of the old stone walls that ran alongside the road. This is why, when you sometimes drive down a country road, you see a giant boulder sitting incongruously in the middle of the top of some old wall. And people have asked me, why did the old timers put those giant boulders in the middle of the wall? Because by now, after 80, 90, 100 years or so, the surface of the giant boulder is just as mossy and old as the regular wall. So it looks as though it was something that was put there by the original builders, but it wasn't. And all kinds of things like that happen to various architectural remnants. We don't, for instance, have a very sophisticated appreciation of how often buildings were picked up and moved from one place to another by the old timers. It was very often, especially in an era when there were no telephone poles with wires on them to stop passage of large, tall things that were moving down the road. This also has something to do with the question you originally asked about time, too. We're talking with the older farmers and the shapers of this part of the country about a very different relationship to the passage of time than the one we have now. We're very production oriented now. If we can't get a certain thing done in a certain amount of time with certain resources, we either give up on it or call somebody with a bigger hammer or otherwise pass this task down the line. This was something that the old timers could not afford to do, and so they tended to take whatever time was necessary for a particular job to get that job done. They worked, as far as I can tell, during every single available second of daylight, all the time, and that is how they accomplished so much.
Given that the walls you said were built at a maximum window of 50 years, or perhaps as small as 30, all of this sense of proportion and hatching the stone and everything, that was learned by trial and error, and people passed it on to each other?
I think so, and I think it was. I think in some ways it was almost instinctive. There has been an argument made about an instinctive approach to vernacular building, and it's quite evident in the ways that these projects are like one another in different parts of the region where there couldn't have been any contact among people. There's a response to the use of this material. New England stone is different from stone in other parts of the world because of its diversity, because of its incredible variety of shapes and forms, and so different techniques were worked out by different people in different places across the region to deal with that stone, the many types that we have over time. And I'm sure that people shared information, although certainly that was not possible to do it in the way that we do it now. It would have had to always be face to face. But you know, we had an apprenticeship system in place here then too, so young people did not tend to go to college. They rather would move to another household and learn all the skills that were available to them in that household. And this is one way that techniques of everything from barn framing to stone wall building were passed from generation to generation. The whole system of the moving of information from one generation to the next was quite different than from what it is now. And it was much more oriented toward the making and maintenance of things rather than ideas.
Now, with some of these stones, you wouldn't have been able to lift.
That's right.
So what did they use?
They have many, many tricks, but the basis of most of them is that the stone doesn't come off the ground. If you can't pick it up, you can move it. My uncle used to say to me, if you can move it an inch, you can move it a mile. Right? You just have to move it a mile and an inch at a time. For instance, suppose this stone is actually 4 feet long and 3 feet wide and thus weighs 2 tons. I would have a shot at putting it up on this wall all by myself, as long as I can roll it over with a bar. If I can do that, I can build a temporary ramp that is shallow enough to roll it up. I can put it on a little temporary road made of planks with pipes in between the planks so that the whole thing can be pulled. I can take my team of horses and put what I call a rolling hitch on it. A rolling hitch is an attachment of rope or chain that, if pulled on, will not drag the piece but rather flip it. All you have to do is tie the knot back on the other side, and then it pulls it right over like that. A rolling hitch will bring it up any incline. If I'm building a foundation and I want to put a great big stone into it at 6 feet off the ground in terms of where the basement floor is, I don't bring it to the basement floor. I drag it down the back bank, which is already higher than the front of the wall anyway. Same thing if I'm trying to stone up, say, a well or any other structure that's got a higher grade anywhere near it. If it's a wall and I don't want to build a temporary ramp, or the topography doesn't permit me, I can leave one end of the wall down at ground level until I've managed to roll up all the big things that I want to put into it. So there are many, many little tricks, and they were adept at the use of leverage as well in terms of creating pulley systems and chain falls and other techniques to minimize the lifting. So once you start to imagine these stones being moved in a way that they don't leave the ground before they go to their spot, it's a lot easier to see how they managed to do this. The other thing, of course, was their relationship to the passage of time. We're production oriented, they were task oriented.
Mhm.
Whatever amount of time they needed to do a thing like that, whether it was rolling a giant boulder into place in a foundation or cutting a huge one into small pieces in a field to move it out in smaller, more easily handleable increments, was what they would do. So they simply took the amount of time that a given task required. It seems funny and almost paradoxical that they got all this done without rushing, if you will. But I think the answer to that is their relentlessness.
Well, it was also, you had your family working, I mean, your children would be working.
Yes, and they helped each other. A lot of these activities were, in some sense, communal, both agricultural ones related to getting hay or corn shucked or that sort of thing. So they did exchange labor, and the families were larger. You really have to think of them as households rather than families. And not, this was a time when nuclear family relations were not responsible for every person who might live in a household. There would be servants, there might be hired people who were boarders. There would be adolescents from other households who would come to live with you. It was quite common, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, for most adolescents to be sent to another home when they reached a certain age for a certain period of time.
Mhm.
You'd send yours away and accept somebody else's, and the expectation would be that you would train them. Learn to build stone walls and people who would not. The other thing is the title, which my publisher is always mad at me about not explaining. The granite kiss is something that you get when you smash your fingers between stones. It's not romantic in any way.
And that's how we had it.
Okay.
It's like it's-
There's nice walls of
That's the story I got.